Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Recha Kodash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to begin the book of Amos, which Amos was a prophet right around the time of the divided kingdom, right, in which you had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And in particular, as you read here, he was of the southern kingdom, right? But the Lord sent him to prophesy concerning the northern kingdom as well, So dealing with Amos, I pulled up here a nice timeline that I was able to find. Interestingly enough, seems the blue letter has a lot more features than I was privy to. And also, if you look down here, if you come all the way down here, these are the secrets and the gems. So here you can see a lot of utilities that the Blue Letter Bible comes with, other than just the lexicon and the concordance and so on. But you can see here they have encyclopedias, right? Charts and outlines, timelines, and so on. So I believe it was timelines. When you click on that, you should be able to access some of these different timelines here. So this was particularly the Old Testament timeline, right? But they have different images and so on over here as well. Cool. So there's a lot more features that are very useful here in the blue letter. But anyway, dealing with the prophet Amos. So when we see we went through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, as well as 1st and 2nd Chronicles, right? So if you can see the timeline on here, Slakia, we didn't go through 1st Chronicles, we went through 2nd Chronicles, which covered this period of 1st Kings and 2nd Kings. So we see that Amos is placed right here, right, somewhere in the midst of the events of 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings. And in particular, as we read in the book of Amos, we'll see that he was during the reign of, I believe, it was the Jeroboam II. This is another timeline here. Jeroboam II and Uzziah. So we see Amos right here, right? Jeroboam II reigned all the way up until Pekahiah, or Menahem, actually. So Amos overlaps somewhere right there. Now, at this point in time, the northern kingdom is still in their land, right? The southern kingdom is also still in their land. And the Assyrians haven't, besieged Samaria to deport, the destroy and deport the bulk of the northern kingdom yet. Okay, so that's the setting of the prophet Amos coming on the scene. All right, so let's get into it. This is the book of Amos, chapter 1, verse 1. The words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So we know here, right, this gives us a timeline. Right now we're dealing with the time period of Uzziah, and this Jeroboam would have to be Jeroboam II. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, Tekoa, and when you look that up, that is a region. Let's see if the blue letter has it right. It says a town in the hill country of Judah near Hebron, built by King Rehoboam of Judah, birthplace of Amos. Okay, so he was of there, the southern kingdom there, at least based on this piece of information. And as you can see, it says he was among the herdmen, right? So we know who the herdmen are, shepherds. So yeah, sheep raiser, sheep dealer, sheep tender, and that's what Amos was doing up until the Lord put the spirit on him, right, and called him to come in and prophesy. Now it mentions here 2 years before the earthquake. So there seems to have been some major earthquake at some point here around this time that is documented, because, or at least when I say documented, I mean it's remembered. And you can imagine it like today, how when you mentioned Katrina, right, when Katrina happened, literally everybody or most people think back to Hurricane Katrina, right? And so it's like a common point of reference. Or when somebody says like 9/11, most people don't think of just three numbers. They think of an event because they're so widely known. And when we look here, see the earthquake. There's another account here in Zechariah 14. Let me see. Is this the 14:5, right? And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azal. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord Yahweh my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. So there's another reference to it there. So this had to have been something major, right? Whatever earthquake that was. Anyway, verse 2. And he said, the Lord Yahweh will roar from Zion, and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the inhabitants of the shepherds shall mourn, and the top of Carmel shall wither. Okay, and we know, see if it shows it on here, if we can find Carmel. Maybe it doesn't explicitly show it on here. But long story short here, the point that Amos is making here is that the Lord has a quarrel, right? He has a point to make, and it's going to be heard from wherever, okay? And he goes into the top of Carmel shall wither, right? Carmel, you being known as like Mount, right? Mount Carmel, but you can imagine there was like that good pasture up on there, okay? And that's why it mentions here the shepherds mourning and the top of Carmel withering. But you'll notice that Amos tends to also speak sometimes in like almost like a poetic-ish kind of sense when he makes certain points and connections over there. Okay, nevertheless, in verse 2, the main point is the Lord has something to say. Okay, verse 3, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. Now, Amos repeats this for 3 transgressions, right, and for 4. And it's not like to say literally that Damascus, which the Damascus here is referring to the Syrians, right, Aram. Not to say that they committed literally 3 sins, and then on the 4th one, the Lord got tight. It's really more of a similitude to represent 3 as in you hit your limit at 3, and 4 you went overboard, right? And so the Lord is saying here via the mouth of Amos that pretty much he's going to bring judgment upon the Syrians for the things that they've done, for the transgressions they've committed, mainly against the Lord by coming against Israel. So as it says here, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. And Gilead, when you look over here, right, you have here Ramoth Gilead. So Gilead was mainly on the east of the river Jordan. Okay, and you have the Arameans or the Syrians, which are north up here. All right. And so as it says, you have threshed them with threshing instruments of iron. Now, when you deal with the harvest, right, and you have the grains that are still inside of the husk, you would lay them out on the threshing floor, and then you would thresh them, right, by many means. You would beat the crops, so to speak, by smashing something, as you can see here. One is like instrument of iron, but something that was tough against the grains or the crops on the threshing floor, and this would basically peel the husks off of it, and you can just get the grains after. But the Lord is likening the Syrians and the oppression and the things that they did against Israel, particularly here Gilead, as onto getting those grains, right, via a threshing instrument of iron. So basically a harsh oppression. Now, when we cross-reference this here, you can see here, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. So an example here, right, when we go back to the timeline, we see here that Amos is right around this time, right? That's 760, it's 753, right around there. So he's after Elisha, right after Elijah. And brief contemporary with Jonah, right, according to this timeline on here. Now, when we take a look back here, we'll notice that once again, we see Amos right here overlapping with Jonah, right, as contemporaries, as well as with Isaiah and Hosea. But he precedes them just a little bit. But we also see here Jehu, right, which was around this time, right, with you have Elijah and a few others on here. But we see that Jehu, the time of Jehu was before the time of Amos. Amos comes after the time of Jehu here, right? So when we come here and we look at some references, we'll see here, in particular, right, this here in 2 Kings 8 was when, I believe this was Elisha speaking on to Hazael, and then he wept because of the things that he saw that the Syrians would do to Israel. But the part I want to really get is, here we go, 2 Kings 10 and 32. So when we go up a bit here, we can see here, this is dealing with the time of Jehu, right? So 2 Kings 10 and 31, it says, but Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord Yahweh, God of Israel, with all his heart. For he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. In those days, the Lord Yahweh began to cut Israel short, and Hazael, which was a Syrian, smote them in all the coasts of Israel. So in the days, right, in which Jehu was around, you had this going on, right? It says here, from Jordan eastward, and when we pull up this map, we're talking about the river Jordan here. Eastward would be on this side. So the half tribe of Manasseh, Gad, Reuben. And as it says, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manassites from Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan, which that's sort of what we're reading of over here. So basically you had the Hazael was going around, right, the Syrians, smiting and conquering and oppressing Israel. And you see here, one of the locations was Gilead, right, which is, like I showed here, around this region over here. So going back to the book of Amos, the Lord is saying here, for the things you did, this being an example, I'm going to bring judgment upon you. I'm not going to let that slide. Verse 4, but I will send a fire into the house of Hazael, which shall devour the palaces of Ben-Hadad. And when you deal with like Ben-Hadad, and I believe even Hazael, but mainly like Ben-Hadad, this is like not a more like a throne name, right? Like how you would have Pharaoh. Sometimes the scriptures will just say Pharaoh, and you got to do the research to find out, okay, which Pharaoh is this referring to? Okay, but long story short, the Lord is saying here, by saying I will send a fire into your house which shall devour the palaces, is to say that he's going to bring judgment and destruction upon these nations, particularly here Syria, or the Syrians. Verse 5, and I will break also the bar of Damascus, and cut off the inhabitants from the plain of Aven, and him that holdeth the scepter in the house of Eden. Okay, and these are all regions that are associated or located either within or about Damascus. Okay, so as the Lord says here, right, the bar meaning the gates. This is once again metaphorical talk of, really it did manifest in the physical, but it's more so around the lines of when destruction comes, be it mainly from an opposing force, an enemy, they would besiege you, they would break down your gates so they can get access into the city or into the towns, right? And as it says, cut off the inhabitants, so they would kill people, destroy people, take people captive, right? And him that holdeth the scepter in the house of Eden. Now, when you go into the word Eden here, in some translations, they have it as Beth Eden, which is like a location that they relate to somewhere around the region of Damascus. And you also have Eden as in pleasure, right? Or like luxury or like enjoyment, which is another way to say that their reign, right? The Lord would destroy, right? The ruler of that pleasant reign that they had in which they gained through oppressing us. And the people of Syria shall go into captivity unto Kir, which I believe this is a region in Mesopotamia, saith the Lord. Okay, so this is what Amos prophesied concerning Syria, right? And as we see, we cross-reference this here, particularly that portion of the verse. We can see here in 2 Kings 16:9, and the king of Assyria hearkened unto him. And if we just pop this up over here, we see this is dealing with Ahaz, right? So it says here, and Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord Yahweh, and the treasures of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus, and took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin. Okay, so when we go back to our nice handy dandy timeline over here, firstly, let's go back and deal with Rezin over here, because he will give us a nice timeline, right? So king of Damascus during the reigns of kings Jotham and Ahaz of Judah. So now let's go ahead, take a look at Ahaz or Ahaz, and we can see here Ahaz is post the time of Amos, right? And who was the other king I mentioned? Jotham, and Jotham is right here as well. So what Amos prophesied concerning let's open this up here, right? So what Amos prophesied concerning Damascus, about how they would end up going into captivity onto Kir, was later fulfilled, right, during the time period of Ahaz, when the Assyrian king hearkened and ended up going up against Damascus and taking their people captive over there to Kir, right, fulfilling that prophecy that was made by Amos. So continuing in the book of Amos, chapter 1, verse 6. So now he is spoken concerning Damascus. Verse 6, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. Now with Gaza, right, we're dealing now with like the Philistines, because Gaza we're dealing with down here, which is in Philistia. So here we're dealing with the Philistines, in which judgment is being pronounced against them as well. So it mentions here, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. Why? Because they carried away captive the whole captivity to deliver them up to Edom. Now, when you look here and throughout different times, remember that really this land is still supposed to be part of ours. But there were times when the Philistines would, being that they had jurisdiction over this area, they would breach right into certain cities that belonged onto Israel, take them over, right, and take the people captive. And what do you think happened after that, right? They ended up selling them, okay? And you had buyers, which would be over here, not just Edomites, but remember, you also had Ishmaelites and so on that would be traveling through the land and so on and so forth, okay? So keep in mind that, yes, primarily you have the region of Edom over here, but it doesn't mean you'd never see an Edomite somewhere around here or somewhere around here or somewhere around here, okay? Or even in Philistia. Or it doesn't mean you wouldn't see Philistines over here in Edom or crossing through in Judah somewhere, okay? So those things were going on, similar to how when you go back to the book of Genesis, you had those merchants that ended up buying Joseph and then taking him to Egypt to sell him again over there, right? So that trade, that was also happening. And when we get some cross references here, right, a few examples, let's see, particularly carried the whole captivity, right? This is in 2 Chronicles, right? It says here, moreover, the Lord Yahweh stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines and of the Arabians that were near the Ethiopians. And then it goes on in here. Now, Jehoram, when we go back to the timeline, see if he shows on here. All right, let's use this other one. So we have Jotham. Jehoram. Let's look him up on here. Jehoram. Okay, so we see here, son of Ahab and Jezebel. Let's go back to that verse. That is 2 Chronicles 21 and 16. And so, yeah, there were a couple of Jehorams. So just to be cautious here, not to confuse them. Let's see which one it is. Yeah, it looks like we're dealing with more of a southern kingdom Jehoram. So let's go back and take a look. Jehoram, king of Judah. Yeah, there we go. Jehoram of Judah. So he was right around 853 to 849. His predecessor being Jehoshaphat and his successor being Ahaziah. So he is the one that is referred to here in 2 Chronicles. Perfect. So with that information, let's take a look here and looking down for, I hope they did a good enough job with listing the various kings on here. So we have your Ahaziah. There we go. So we have your Ahaziah, Jehoshaphat. So I believe this is the Joram we're looking at here. If we click on him, let's see here. Okay, there's just a couple of references. But yeah, I believe this is the one we're dealing with here. And the reason I pulled this up here is to show, like, when you do the cross-reference, right, and you're reading about these verses in here, sometimes, you know, some of these events, like these judgments, the Lord says, hey, I'm going to bring judgment of this sort or of that sort against this nation here. Sometimes you'll read a precept or a cross-reference where there's a similar judgment happening, but it might be preceding what you're actually reading about, right? So one example here being this here about the Philistines coming up against Judah and taking them captives and so on. Now this here we're reading of, and we confirm through the timelines that this actually happened before Amos, right? So, you know, it would be an example, but it might not be like the, you know, you just have to be mindful of the time, right? To say, okay, well, this is an example to show you that this is something that the Philistines did. Okay, now in 2 Chronicles 21, it was more particular as a judgment the Lord brought against, you know, this king here. But it's an example, nevertheless, to show you what these Philistines would be doing at this time, right? And even prior. So once again, 2 Chronicles 28 and 18, it says the Philistines also had invaded the cities of the low country and of the south of Judah, and had taken Beth Shemesh and Ajalon and Gederoth and Shoko with the villages thereof, and Timnah with the villages thereof, Gimzo also and the villages thereof, and they dwelt there. So what do you think they did to the captives that were there once they took over those areas? Right, they would keep some of them, but it would sell some of them because that was money. All right, so this was an example of some of the things that they were doing there around this time. And you can imagine it might not just have been Edomites that were you know, their consumers, so to speak, but Edom being maybe a primary or main buyer, hence they're mentioned in here. Okay, so the Lord says, because of what you did, Philistines, right, against my people, you're gonna get some judgment too. Verse so that whole captivity being delivered, being like when they took over those cities and those areas, right, they ended up selling them, right, and so on, to these neighboring nations, Edom being one of them. Verse 7, but I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof. Once again, to say that the Lord is going to bring judgment upon them for doing so, right? And this comes in many forms, but one of the main ones is when the Lord raises up a nation, right, like the Assyrians, right, or the Babylonians, and they come and they take over that region, and that includes. Remember, when we read it, it's from the perspective of, oh, this nation came against, like the Babylonians came against Israel, they destroyed the walls and the temple, but they didn't stop at just Israel. There were other neighboring nations that were also destroyed and made captive under the Babylonians. We just primarily care about Israel. So when those nations came to that region, Israel was one of their targets, but these other nations were also a part of their targets, and that was also a form of judgment that the Lord brought upon them. Verse 8, and I will cut off the inhabitant of Ashdod, and him that holdeth the scepter in Ashkelon. And once again, going back to this map, you can see these are all regions in Philistia, or Palestine, aka the place in question now, or the subject matter. And I will turn my hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, saith the Lord Yahweh. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyrus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole captivity to Edom, and remembered not the brotherly covenant. And now, historically, when you deal with Tyrus, right, Tyre and Zidon, which were up here, remember going back to the time of King David and King Solomon, which precedes the time of Amos, right? Back around this time, we had a covenant, right, that was made. It was really a friendship, right, but a covenant was made between David and Hiram, right, and then reaffirmed with Solomon. Okay, so there was that piece in which they provided us resources. We gave them, Solomon, as you can see, gave them like food and grain and all these things they needed as well. But it seems here that at some point, right, things started to change, and as it says here, they remembered not that brotherly covenant, hence doing something similar. And you can imagine here, though there isn't any many like explicit accounts on this, there are other accounts of the Lord speaking against Tyre and Zidon for them coming against Israel or taking advantage of Israel's downfall. Okay, so you can imagine in one of those events that also being the ability to make money off of Israelite slaves. Hence, remember the Tyre and Zidon, they were merchant people, right? Seafaring people as well. So seeing that opportunity, whether it was during the Assyrians coming against us, the Babylonians coming against us, whatever it was, they have, they sought opportunity to capitalize off of Israelite slaves. Hence that whole captivity, as it says, being delivered to Edom, which would be in this case one of those buyers, right? So doing a cross reference here, it says, let's see if we can find a few. All right, there's here Isaiah speaks against them as well, but I believe Ezekiel also speaks against them. Yeah, here's one example. In Ezekiel 26:2, it says, "Son of man." Now remember, Ezekiel is way after Amos. Okay, Ezekiel comes into the picture. Let's see if they show. There we go. He comes into the picture somewhere along here, and this is like after, because Ezekiel was a captive in Babylon prior to Jerusalem being destroyed. He was a captive in Babylon, in which the Lord showed him things to come. Right, the Lord showed him the judgment that would come upon, Jerusalem and all that. So you see Ezekiel here, and he precedes this fall of Judah to Babylon. Okay, but the example here in Ezekiel is just to show you that the Lord spoke not just with Amos, but also with different prophets against cities like Tyre and Zidon, because though you don't really hear too much about conflict with Israel and them, they still played a role in that. Right, one example being selling Israelites, as captives to Edom and these neighboring nations as well. So here in Ezekiel 26:1, or really verse 2, it says, "Son of man, because that Tyrus hath said against Jerusalem, Aha, she is broken. That was the gates of the people. She is turned unto me. I shall be replenished. Now she is laid waste." And that was to say that for a period of time, especially during the time of King Solomon and a little after, we had control over this region, right? This Levantine, right, region, which was a very powerful position to be in, especially concerning trade, because anything coming down would have to go through us. Anything going up would have to go through us, and it was more expensive to go by sea with some things, right? And so trade, whether it's coming from the east down, and Egypt, they had a lot of grain, they had a lot of resources. Arabia, which was south, also had a lot of resources, right? That they would then want to trade. So we controlled this route. Guess what? That was very lucrative. So when Israel fell and lost that, Tyre, right? They were also merchantmen. They were happy about that, as it's saying here in Ezekiel, right? Because that it says she is broken. That was the gates of the people, i.e., like the trade route, right? Now she is broken, so now they get to capitalize off of that. Okay, but this is just an example to highlight the lack of innocency from even these nations here of Tyre and Sidon. So going back to what Amos is saying here, he's also calling out their transgressions with what they did against Israel here, and saying how the Lord is going to bring judgment upon them as well. So now in Amos chapter 1, verse 10, it says, "But I will send a fire on the wall of Tyrus, which shall devour the palaces thereof." And that fire, once again, representing judgment, came in many forms. When you look at the history of Tyre and Zidon, judgment came upon them many times, right, from different people. When the Babylonians came, they weren't exempt. When the Greeks came, they weren't exempt. All right. And I believe even the Assyrians at some point, okay, they weren't exempt there. So, in other words, the Lord brought judgment upon them. And here Amos's job is really in some cases he's specific about what kind of judgment will happen. In other cases, he's just giving the message to say, hey, you're not going to go unpunished, right? The Lord is going to bring some calamity upon you as punishment. But if you have just that to go off of, sometimes it's based on a future prophet coming on the scene, one who's maybe a bit closer to the time of that judgment the Lord has planned, who then speaks against Tyre again to reaffirm this thing and say, hey, the Lord is going to do specifically X, Y, and Z to you. And that'll be like a hint for you to know, oh, okay, this is maybe the judgment the Lord intended to have against them. But at least here in Amos 1, the main point here is that the Lord is saying, I've seen the things you guys have done, and you're going to pay for it. So verse 11, it says, "Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword," right, being Israel, "and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever." So when you deal with the actual man Esau, right, we read about how when Jacob came back, he hugged him and everything, and there wasn't really conflict there. But we start to see, right, post Israel being delivered out of Egypt, that conflict there, right, and them refusing to let us go through their land, and them coming out to fight against us, and really from there continuing, it's just been this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And when they had the opportunity, you damn right they took it to pursue us, right, Israel, whether it was taking certain cities, because they did that too, right? Remember, Israel had them in captivity, but after a period of time, they broke loose. And then they would also attack certain cities, lie in wait for certain opportunities to take advantage as well. So for all these things, the Lord said, right, dealing in the historical context here, for all these things, the Lord is going to bring judgment upon them. Now, of course, this isn't, this is as you read in the scriptures, the Lord says, I will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So, this here, Amos is saying this, and yeah, it pertains to the things they were doing then. But, the same thing still resonates today, right? That perpetual anger and that wrath was kept till that time of Amos. The Lord brought judgments upon them for the things they did. But even all the way up until now, right? They still continue with that wrath. They still hold on to that, and they still target, right, Israel, and therefore the Lord is still going to bring judgment upon them yet again in this time. Okay, but going back to the timeline here in verse 12, it says, "But I will send fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Basra," right, all regions there in Edom. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of the children of Ammon, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have ripped up the women with child of Gilead, that they might enlarge their border. Now, once again, you take a look at that map, Ammon is right over here. So when it mentions Gilead, you can see here, and enlarging their border, quite literally, right, there were cases, right, where they would basically attack certain regions here, whenever they had the power, okay, or they saw a moment of opportunity for them, and basically try to gain more land here at the expense of Israel, okay, and hence they weren't innocent as well. So if you really take a look, you see that the Lord is really pronouncing judgment around all these neighboring nations. Tyre and Sidon, Aram, right, the Syrians, Ammon, right? Now, it doesn't explicitly mention Moab in this chapter, but you have Edom, you have the Philistines. Okay, so the Lord is just pretty much pronouncing judgment against all of them within this region for all the transgressions that have been going on. And as you can see, right, ripped up the women with child, right, in brutal fashion. Once again, expanding their border while at the expense of Israel. Verse 14, but I will kindle a fire in Rabbah, and it shall devour the palaces thereof, with shouting in the day of battle, with a tempest in the day of the whirlwind. And their king shall go into captivity, he and his princes together, saith the Lord Yahweh. And that was a judgment that was pronounced against Ammon for the deeds that they did, okay, in which the Lord saw. Right, and the shouting in the day of battle and with a tempest in the day of the whirlwind is just another way of saying like that judgment the Lord would bring, particularly, right, that day of battle would be like another nation that would be that would take them captive, okay, and that's why it mentions their king and princes going into captivity. So that brings us to the end of the book of Amos, the first chapter. As we saw, this is mainly him pronouncing judgment against these neighboring nations. Basically a message from the Lord, and we were able to see right around what time Amos was, and what was going on really at that time. So with that, Lord willing, this was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Recha Kodesh. Until next time, Shalom.